Today on NPR News presents Bright Ideas, Fresh Thoughts on Big Issues. I'm Stephen Smith. Each month I invite a guest to the forum here at Minnesota Public Radio headquarters to talk about important issues and ideas before a live audience. My guest this time is Twin Cities designer Doug Powell. He leads the firm Schwartz Powell and is president of the influential national design organization AIGA. After a family medical crisis, Doug Powell and his wife Lisa had a revelation that designers can help lead social change by using their skills to help make complex problems and solutions clear. Powell became a specialist in design for healthcare. He's also become something of a national evangelist for the power of design to drive social progress. This time on Bright Ideas, please welcome designer Doug Powell. Thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start off with the basics. I don't think everybody knows what a designer actually is. They might think that it's someone who has a lot of pens and some paper and some rulers, but it's more than that.
At one point, that might have been true, and probably was true in a previous generation. Certainly, those very traditional tools of the trade were scattered across the desk of many designers. Now, designers use those tools occasionally, but often use technology, computers, as the tool to create what they dream up. But it's really a very thoughtful and very intellectual process that we go through.
When you say designer, you're talking about people who primarily work in the visual world.
Correct. Yes. Now, designers, there are many ways to define design and many disciplines in which designers work.
Right.
We could be talking about architects. We could be talking about product designers, graphic designers. That's my background. Mm-hmm. We could also be talking about some of the emerging disciplines in design, like interaction design.
And that means website
design. It could be websites. It could be various forms of media and technology. The way that a user interacts with a piece of technology. Yes.
And how do you decide what to do? Which among the in this palette of things you could choose to do? How does a contemporary designer try to do it all now?
That's an interesting question, and one that's been kind of evolving as the profession of design has been evolving and sort of subdividing. At one point back in the days of the pens and the layout paper and so on, all the tools that you described earlier, designers were oftentimes much more generalist and covered a lot more territory. Of course, at that time there was a lot less territory to cover. Now we've got new areas that designers are moving into, and so we're finding that designers are specializing in areas much more so, diving deeper into a subdiscipline than they might have a generation ago.
We'll get into the field of design a bit more later, but I want to ask you how you personally got into it. Where did you pick up the love of designing things?
I was the kid who could draw.
Comics.
Mostly fire trucks. Mm-hmm. It was my earliest motif. We had a lot of Lego building blocks in my house growing up, and as I grew into my teenage years, the fire trucks kind of evolved into album covers, and mm-hmm. I think that's
back when there were albums.
Yes, I know. What a great piece of graphic design. What a great artifact of graphic.
So wait, would you design album covers for bands that already existed? Would you redesign like?
I replicated.
I see.
Album covers of the
you interpreted
late 70s,
some of the great album
some of the greats of the late 70s and early 80s.
Uh-huh.
Yes, it was a portfolio filled with Boston and Electric Light Orchestra.
Right, those were good.
Yes, so they were awesome. I think that's how many designers of my generation and before got into the field, was through the visual arts. That's how we kind of acquired this interest in making things visual and being creative in that way. I think that's changing now. I think that's still one avenue that designers get into the field, but now I think a lot of young designers have acquired that interest through technology, through an early interest maybe in gaming or in other forms of technology.
You write a blog at your Schwartz Powell sort of company website, and I read there recently a quote that I liked, which said, "Design is actually a lifestyle." I think this was a quote that you used in a graduation speech that you gave recently. "Design is a lifestyle. You will care passionately about things that others cannot see." What does that mean?
That was that was a quote by a friend of mine named Michael Vanderbilt, who's an iconic designer based in San Francisco, and I think what Michael is saying in that quote is that that's our job as designers, is to pay attention to the stuff that the rest of the world is not paying attention to. That we have an obligation to find those details and refine that level of communication that the rest of the world does and probably should ignore. Which is not to say that it's unimportant. I think he's really advocating for that being a pretty noble calling.
Well, when a design of anything works, it's like a beautifully produced movie. Unless you're a film editor or a student of film or a cinematographer, it's unlikely that you'll actually know why a movie looks really good, is really well lit, is really well edited. Right. It just works well. And when it's crummy, for whatever reason, it's off-putting.
Yeah, you described earlier in your intro that designers make the complex clear and simple, and I think that
I took those words from you, actually.
Yeah, well, and they're absolutely true. But underneath the clarity and simplicity, oftentimes is a lot of complexity, and the complexity really sort of fuels that end result.
Let's talk about how you came to combining design with a desire to, not that you didn't have a desire before this happened in your family, but you have a life story about how design and a desire for social change came together, and it's the story of your daughter.
Right. Well, my wife and I had been partners in a design business based in Minneapolis. We founded it together in 1989. And
She's the Schwartz and Schwartz Powell, Lisa Schwartz.
Exactly. And we had been working in this business and doing quite well with it for 13 or 14 years. Founded in 1989. In 2002. Something happened in our life that really kind of turned everything upside down, and that was when our daughter Maya, who was 7 at the time, was just going into 3rd grade, was diagnosed with type 1 diabetes. And
type 1 diabetes is not adult onset.
Right, exactly. Also known as juvenile diabetes.
Right.
So when you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, it means that that person is basically required to go on a very rigid routine of blood tests and insulin injections in order to stay alive.
Right.
So the diagnosis experience is really quite sudden and severe and cruel. Quite frankly, one day you're living a fairly ordinary life, and the next day you're leading a life that is filled with blood and needles and medicine, and worst of all for Lisa and me, complicated math. It's outrageous how much a part of tracking and calculating becomes your daily routine with diabetes,
especially pre-cell phone apps.
Yes, well, this was 2000.
I mean, I don't mean that lightly.
Absolutely.
There are tools there now.
Right. So this is 2002. So, pre-smartphone for sure. But it was 2002, for goodness sake. So we thought, there must be some really kid-friendly, backpack or children's book or video or something that would help us go through this experience. Because, we're dealing as parents with this intense emotional trauma of all of a sudden realizing that our child is going to be living with this pretty serious health condition for the rest of her life, and at the same time trying to intake and learn a really complicated medical routine that we have to be on top of and functioning with pretty much immediately. So it's a very intense experience. So we fully expected that that there would be something that would help us with that, and we looked high and low for that. We didn't find it. We found the materials that the diabetes clinic provided for us to be completely inadequate, and we quite immediately began to and intuitively began to create materials that would help us and that would serve our purpose in a better way.
So you started to put together what? When you say you designed tools, what were they?
We were putting together. I mean, this was all just very natural. There was no plan. There was no big vision for this. We were just putting together what we needed. We were doing, quite frankly, what I think any designer would do in that situation. We were rapid prototyping. We were creating cheat sheets for ourselves, and talking earlier about the complicated mathematics. Literally, just things, templates for us to kind of go through this calculation. Tracking sheets and reference, really crude reference sheets for ourselves. Our house became a design lab without us really intending it to be. But that's sort of as I reflect on it, that is kind of the early process that we were going through in a very intuitive way.
And that led to actually a business.
Right. Well, we, after a while, we kind of realized, hey, maybe there's a need beyond just our family for the type of materials that we were creating. We continued to refine those early ideas. We shared them with some people that we had gotten to know in the diabetes community, and the response that we got was, "You really need to do this. There's a real need for this." So we began to, think about what if, how might this go out in the world, and really, again, without any sort of business roadmap, we plunged forth into producing a set of products, a line of products, which we called Type 1 tools, and we launched that as a business in 2004.
Called Health Smart.
Health Simple was the eventual name of the business. So Type 1 tools sort of evolved into Health Simple over the course of the subsequent year or two, and that vision, that business vision, kind of grew and expanded from there.
So as you talk about designing better environments, better healthcare environments, better healthcare information, better healthcare materials, what are the sort of key principles that you use? I mean, looking beyond the diabetes work, what are the key principles that you use, and what are the key problems in the way sort of our experience with healthcare is designed at the moment?
Well, think about all of us have had the experience of being in a clinic, being in a doctor's office, and being overwhelmed, being intimidated, being confused. Why does it have to be that way? Why is it that the language that's used in that setting, whether it's on the printed sheet or spoken to us, why is it that that language is not the language that we use in our everyday life?
Well, the physicians would say it's a scientific language where specificity and minute detail actually matters.
Right. It matters to them, but when I go home and I have to take care of myself or my kid or my elderly parent, then there's a serious communication gap there. I'm sitting there going, wait a second, what were those words that they were telling me? Was it that I'm supposed to do two of these and then one of those, or
can you give me an example of some words that you've changed?
Well, we're not
to make them more, or some words that you've interpreted to make them more user friendly.
Well, it's not that we're changing words, but with the diabetes tools, I mean, we were just interestingly, it's not so much what a designer would do is not so much about changing the language. It's changing the form of the language, making those complicated words and sentences into pictures, into images.
Okay.
I think there's an assumption. It's an ignorant assumption more than anything, but an assumption on the part of the sort of traditional medical community that we all take in information, we all comprehend information in one way. And that is by starting at the top left corner of a page and reading until we get to the bottom right corner of the page. Some people take in information that way. Maybe you do. I don't. I take in and understand in a more complete and effective way information when I see images. So there's a fundamental shift there that we were playing around with in the early work that we were doing with the diabetes tools. And those tools were very simple, very, there was nothing really, there was nothing high tech about them. They were very straightforward: picture, word, picture, description, picture, number. It was almost like if you remember the game as a kid, the memory game, that sort of process of turning over a card and seeing an image and then remembering where it goes in the matrix. That was very much the principle that we were working with there. If I'm making a school lunch for my kid who's got type 1 diabetes, and I need to quickly calculate, because I'm racing off to work in about 3.5 minutes, I need to quickly calculate the insulin dose. And if I have to go and look through that phone book thick reference guide to find out the carbohydrate value for that peanut butter and jelly sandwich, that makes that whole process just immensely more complicated than it needs to be. But if I have a rote memory that peanut butter and jelly sandwich equals 30 grams of carbs, and that equals this amount of insulin, I'm good to go. That whole process becomes much more intuitive and easy for me as a human to go through.
This idea that design should be more and more not just involved in, but relied on for all kinds of things, for social change, for complex business activity, for even, for example, here at Minnesota Public Radio, we had a design firm come in and do design thinking with us about how to potentially restructure our organization. And this is a phenomenon that has happened really, it seems to me, in the last 15 years, where 20 years, where designers have moved out of the realm of drafting tables and graphic arts and are doing much more complicated work in society.
Well, when Lisa and I first founded our business in 1989, I mean, what we were designing for then, I mean, it was always about the outcome. When a client would come to us, they would say, we need a logo or we need a poster. As the decade of the 90s grew along, it was, we need a website, right? It was always about that end point. And that end point was always very well defined. And now what you're talking about with designers coming into Minnesota Public Radio and talking to you about design thinking, what they're doing is applying the method of design to a situation, a scenario, a problem, a question that doesn't necessarily have that presumed outcome that we used to be dealing with. So we're moving from, and this is where I get into sort of tricky territory because designers can be pretty prickly about this transition that we're in as a profession. But we're moving from designing a defined outcome, an artifact,
a physical
thing, into designing something else.
A process,
a system, yes,
a solution, that kind of thing.
So it's murky territory, and we're definitely in a time of movement and transformation in the design profession that's quite frankly uncomfortable for a lot of people in our world because we don't really know what's at the end of this road yet. It's a little unknown.
Can you give an example or two of successful designer interventions, if you will, where there was a problem, a social problem that designers got together and made change.
Right. One of my favorite stories about design-driven social change comes from an organization called Project M, which was founded maybe a decade or so ago by a guy named John Bielenberg, who had built a career for himself as a corporate identity and brand designer. Really quite a successful guy. And then he realized that that wasn't really a very meaningful charge for himself, and he wanted to do something with his life and career that meant more to himself personally and the world around him. So he dropped out. He formed this organization called Project M, and what he does is he assembles teams of design students. And they drop themselves into various locations around the world, and they embed themselves in a community, working with local citizens, community leaders, to kind of understand what the dynamics of that particular area are, and to figure out what some of the sore spots might be that design could possibly address. One of the early stories that came out of Project M was when they went to Hale County, Alabama, and specifically to a town called Greensboro. And Hale County is one of the poorest counties in the United States. Terrible unemployment, all sorts of just economic distress there. And the design team there identified basically three problems that they wanted to address. One was this desolate main street, small town Main Street in Greensboro, just storefront after storefront of vacancies up and down Main Street.
A familiar scene across the country, including in the state of Minnesota.
Exactly. Secondly, that there was this horrible high unemployment, and that the main career track in that particular part of the country is through food service. You know, that's a real aspirational sort of job track for people in Hale County. And thirdly, it was a high rate of teen pregnancy and hence single moms, and that, of course, added to the unemployment problem.
Sure.
So there were also opportunities in Hale County. It's a very rich agricultural region, and so there's a lot of local farming. And there's because the Main Street was in such bad shape, the real estate costs were low, and there's a really rich social fabric there. And when people got together, whether it was for social or for a church social or a family gathering, they got together around pie. Sweet pie, savory pie. Pie was
always a good plan to get together around pie.
Pie was sort of the hot dish of that part of Alabama.
Okay.
So this design team kind of put this whole combination of challenges and opportunities together, and they created something called Pie Lab on Main Street in Greensboro. They were able to acquire a storefront retail space. And they created a pie bakery there. And in this bakery was a wide open space with a long communal table. So residents were invited to come in, grab a slice of pie that was sourced from local farms, and to sit down with their neighbors and have a conversation. And meanwhile, designers were sort of circulating around this space and picking up on the conversations and engaging with these local residents to see, you know, what are they seeing around them? What are the opportunities for designers to work with them? The Pie Lab is staffed by single moms, so there's a job training aspect to it that sort of feeds into that food service career track. That is really sort of one of the few opportunities for people to really kind of find gainful employment in that part of the state. So it has this a lot of successful aspects to it. And what I love about the story is that this is a solution, an idea that could never come from any sort of conventional problem-solving method. If
You'd have to have a team of wacky designers on the streets who are
exactly
coming up with this.
If you took that set of problems to a big business, to a government agency, to a traditional philanthropy, and said, here, find a solution to this, they would come up with a job training thing, or they would come up with some sort of,
there'd be a report in a binder, in a three-wing binder.
Very predictable, yeah, very,
with footnotes.
Very stale solution.
And bad visuals.
Exactly. There certainly wouldn't be pie, right? So, this is a completely unexpected, completely creative, very engaging, really quite delightful solution to a complex social problem. And one that I would argue could not be developed by anything, as you say, but a group of wacky designers.
You're the president of AIGA. That is 22,000?
Yes, 22,000
strong
members in 66 local chapters around the country.
These are people who make a living doing design.
Our membership is kind of composed of working designers, design educators, and design students. We have quite a large component of our membership that is students.
This idea of engaging designers in social change activity is not universally held, as you hinted before we took a break for the news. Been kind of controversial, actually, as you have been pressing for it as the president of this organization.
It can be, and it's resulted in some very stimulating conversations about where our profession is going. Conversations that absolutely need to happen. This is a profession that really is less than a century old. So we're kind of in our adolescence as a professional discipline, and so we're going through some growing pains and trying to figure out really who we want to be when we grow up. For most of that century, as we discussed earlier, designers have been about making an artifact and making that artifact in a beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, well-crafted way. And that is something that we can never lose as designers. And I'm certainly not advocating that be dismissed, that we lose track of what we've always done and done so well.
Because that pays the bills, among other things.
And it's what distinguishes us as a profession. If we go out there and say, all of a sudden now designers are social change activists, we dismiss what we've always done as visual artists, essentially. That plunges us into a pool that is very crowded and very difficult for us to distinguish ourselves. So we've always got to be doing whatever we do, whether it's designing systems, designing interactions, designing research methodology, or designing social change. We've always got to do that with a sensitivity toward the visual quality of how it's presented.
So what are some of the issues that some of your colleagues are taking on nationwide? If we go, for example, to the AIGA website, I think there's a place there where you describe it as design for good.
Right. So, we've got designers all over the country in 66 local chapters. So, and these designers are just naturally engaged with their community. So we've got projects that cover the gamut from the micro projects of, say, a community garden, quite literally developing signage and educational materials around that particular very small scale experience and really transforming that, all the way up to global issues around sustainability, around we've done a lot of work around election reform, coming out of the 2000 presidential election and the fiasco with the butterfly ballots, which was a design mess. And really presented an opportunity for designers to come in and say, hey, we could have really helped you out here.
And then there are some specific locations that I noticed that were described. For example, there was an effort to produce sort of a new way of looking at the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, where designers went to Pine Ridge, which is one of the poorest, if not the poorest, places in the United States, and to create kind of a new palette of experience on the web and elsewhere for places like that. So there are a lot of different kinds of ways that designers can get involved in both local and national issues.
Absolutely, and what we're seeing is the designers themselves are the ones who are taking the initiative to find these issues. That's one of the things that I think is really important about working in this way, is that we've got to find the issues and areas, as Lisa and I did very sort of intuitively with our work in diabetes. That was an issue that had a deep personal connection to us, that we had a deep personal connection with. We had a passion for that. We really cared about it because it meant something to us. That is an important aspect of designers working in this way, that we really need to find the issues that we care deeply about. Those are the issues that we can have the most impact in.
What kinds of things aren't appropriate for designers to try and take on, if there are any? How do you decide what kind of social issue you folks can provide leverage to?
I think one of the problems in working in this way is when designers assume that we can do more than we can really do. In other words, when we come into a situation and we don't collaborate with the people who know the most about the issue. And that's something that I think we see a lot of, is designers who come in with their design cape on as a superhero. They sort of parachute into a problem with a big idea. They drop it on the constituency, and then they take off. So there's an aspect of collaboration, of idea sharing, of really sort of building new networks that's so important to working this way. We really need to be finding ourselves at the table with the right people who know the right things about these issues.
You've also spoken about your personal experience with learning from not just the difficulty you had with your daughter's type 1 diabetes and the lack of good sort of tools to deal with that, but also with what you've described as essentially the failure ultimately of the business that you put together that came out of that. Can you explain what happened there and how you learned from failure?
Well, I think there were a lot of successful aspects to the journey that Lisa and I took through that business growth with Health Simple. As a design exercise, it was really successful. I mean, we took a very complex problem and we created a compelling and engaging creative solution to it. So, I mean, that was quite successful. As a business effort, there were successful aspects to it. Mm-hmm. As a PR effort, we got lots of stories written about us and lots of interviews and so on. So, in that regard, it was quite successful. But as an act of social change, if you're diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, or your child is tomorrow, you're going to be left with essentially the same opportunities to get through that experience as we were 10 years ago. Sadly, the materials that we developed just have not gotten out in the world as much as we had hoped they would. And
why is that?
Well, we went through a business growth with Health Simple, and ultimately sold the business to a large consumer products and pharmaceutical company. And they took the business and sadly did not expand on it and take it in the direction that we had hoped they would. That was a risk that we took when we went through that.
You knew you were going to lose control of it. And
absolutely.
that might mean things happen that are great, and it might mean that it goes a direction you don't want.
Right, right. Sadly, it didn't go in the direction that we had hoped. That wasn't something that was completely in our control, but nonetheless, I think if you look back on the experience and judge it under the criteria of whether it was an effective social change act, I think the only conclusion to come to is no, it was not successful. It was a failure, sadly. And I think that for me informs, how we need to be working as designers in that space, and how we need to be measuring the effectiveness of what we're doing.
There's a lot of talk in the business, in sort of the business world writ large, about how we need to be failing faster, failing forward, blah, blah, blah. And I've, run into very few organizations where that's actually adopted and embraced. Except perhaps in Silicon Valley, where there's a lot of failure that happens all the time. There's a lot of churn.
Mm-hmm.
What about in the business of design? Is failure kind of baked into your process because you, for example, come up with 10 different possibilities and 9 of them aren't going to work?
Yeah, designers are perfectionists, so we're not good at failure. And frankly, as business people, we tend to be, and I'm again not going to make a whole lot of friends with this comment, but we tend to be fairly unsophisticated as business people. The typical design practice is run in a very flat and one-dimensional platform. What
does that mean?
We generate revenue through one pipeline, and that is by working with clients.
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of a client service model. Okay, so I mean that's a very easy way to do business. It's very for a good designer can get lots of clients and should be able to run an effective business in that way. But what happens when the economy bottoms out, as it did in the last few years, and the clients who you thought were going to be so loyal evaporate? All of a sudden we realize that there's a flaw in that business model, and we haven't built a very diversified structure for our businesses.
So what other ways might you make a living?
Well, I mean, one of the things that comes out of the diabetes business that sort of informs my answer to that is that we could be developing, incubating, and eventually launching products and services directly out of our design practices and putting them out into the marketplace. So we essentially cut out that client. We go directly to the market.
Be your own entrepreneurs.
Absolutely. And that's something that surprisingly to me just isn't done very much. It's a huge opportunity, I think, for designers to build more robust businesses, to have more control over the direction we're going from a business point of view.
Since I have a real-life designer sitting in the chair next to me, I want to ask you some questions about, just sort of like your day-to-day designing life experience. First of all, because we call our show Bright Ideas, we like to ask people like where they tend to get their inspirations, their, eureka moments. Are you a person who sits and thinks something up, or does it come while you're biking, or how does that work?
I do bike a lot, actually. I bike around town. That's a great way to just find sort of open space and clear mind. And I do a lot of thinking along on my way from home to office,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a great way to find inspiration. I love music, and so I certainly am inspired by that. I love the visual arts, and I love to be outside, and I'm certainly inspired by that.
Are there certain publications or things that you read or look at to stay sort of sharp? Or
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the design field is just filled with great writing and great publications.
Very nice looking magazines.
Absolutely, just gorgeous. So I'm always turning to those publications to kind of stay up to date on what's happening in the profession and so on.
And is it hard to turn it off? I mean, you walk into our room and you see our logo for Bright Ideas there on the wall, and you're thinking, "Ooh, they should have called me." I mean, are you kind of like always seeing what's wrong around you?
It is one of the curses of being, especially a graphic designer, because, typography, the study of and the application and practice of working with letter forms is sort of one of the central practices of our discipline. And typography, of course, is all around us. I mean, and
Letters
most
everywhere.
of it, letters everywhere, and most of it is just absolutely horrendous.
Most of it's Arial, isn't it?
It's terrible. And now
The font Arial seems to be everywhere.
With
Times New Roman, you know?
Exactly. I mean, with all these sort of default typefaces that are used by all of the technology that we use, yeah, it's an assault, and it's really one of the curses of being a graphic designer is that we just can't escape the terrible typography.
You want to just run up and shake somebody and say your sign is horrible.
No, you want to go up and just move the two letters a little closer together.
That's right. Yeah, some of us in the writing business have the same problem with the apostrophe and the possessive that isn't a possessive and that kind of thing.
Now, a designer would have a problem with what we call it the smart quote, or the sort of straight up and down apostrophe,
as opposed to what are they called?
As opposed to the
curly quote.
Yeah.
There's a term for those, aren't they? Curly quotes or something?
Well, it's the quote the way it ought to be.
Right.
Right.
Yeah, that term. So, design. The way you're describing design sounds like a pretty big ambition, if you will. Not only to sweat the details, like how the quote looks, but also to solve huge social problems, to get involved in domains where, arguably designers haven't been deeply trained, perhaps. And it sounds like a huge ambition. Sounds too big.
Aren't being invited in. Right. So yeah, I mean, it is ambitious, and I think it's, as I said earlier, it's evolving and it's transforming, and for me, that's incredibly energizing. I mean, to not know what's over the next horizon, for me, is a really exciting place to be.
So how do you get invited into the places that? Maybe you personally, or designers in general.
We oftentimes don't. I mean, we kind of have to work, on.
So what's your case statement?
A guerrilla basis.
Right. I got a problem to solve. I'm like, say, a local community. I'm in a big shot in a local community. Sell me. Tell me why. Tell me what you can do.
We have to go in there and show what demonstrate our what we have to offer. We can't go in there. The elevator pitch just is not very compelling. Frankly, it's not a great way to sell someone. When Lisa and I were originally working on the diabetes tools, to go in there and describe to a clinician, hey, what you've got here just isn't working very well, and we've got this idea for a new way of doing it. It kind of looks like this, and this is what we're doing. They would just not get it. But as soon as we put it on the table, they got it.
So you have to go in prepared with a presentation. Essentially, you need to do the presentation to get invited in.
Absolutely. We need to be just prototyping our ideas, putting our ideas out there, and really leading with that.
You recently sat down with a top healthcare policy person in the Obama administration to talk about design and the problems in the U.S. healthcare industry. What was that conversation like? And
this was the Assistant Secretary of Health, works under in the Health and Human Services area, and he's essentially the leading public health policymaker in the country. I happen to be working on a project around healthy aging, so it's very relevant to the public health space, and specifically around vaccinations and health screenings for people over the age of 50. Mm-hmm. And these are recommended by the CDC as a way to detect health problems at a relatively early point. So it's a big deal for the CDC and the HHS to get people to do these screenings, on time and on schedule, and not very many people do. So how can we move the needle on that, on that statistic, which is that compliance rate right now is just dismally low.
And do you have any specific schemes in mind?
Well, what we're doing is taking, working collaboratively with experts in the public health space and layering a design-driven approach, sort of a human-centered design-driven approach on top of that. So what I mean by that is really examining, that question of why aren't these people following through on these health screenings? What are the barriers there? Really getting into their lives and understanding on that daily basis, what are the, why isn't this happening? And conversely, what are the things in their life that are that inspire them, that move them, and that trigger them to do healthy things? So how can we find the triggers there, and maybe find some openings for us to insert messaging, education around these health screenings at unexpected points.
In addition to the diabetes and the other stuff you've talked about, are there one or two public health issues that you personally would really like to take on and use design to change?
I think aging in general is, as the baby boom generation, we've heard so much about this, is aging, and we're seeing this sort of demographic bubble kind of moving through the later stages of life. I think we've got to. There's a huge opportunity to really address what that whole experience of growing old is like, and where it happens. Why does it have to happen in the ways that it has happened forever and ever? And are there opportunities for us to use technology, for us to use media in ways that are creative, and that could lead to a more humane experience?
So going back to the hanging chads, so talking about the hanging chads and the ballots, did designers solve that problem?
Well, what's interesting about that the outcome of that process was that it triggered a whole bunch of designers saying, "Well, here's my solution to this," and there were just some beautifully designed and really quite effective and simple, straightforward prototypes of ballot designs that came out of that. There was a whole sort of online design charrette that happened.
A charrette is a French word for a gathering of people to sort something out. Usually architects and designers do that kind of thing.
An exercise where a design problem is placed in front of a group, and there's sort of a group exercise.
Kind of a design hoedown.
Exactly.
Yeah,
right. Exactly. So that whole experience, the hanging chad, just triggered all sorts of. I mean, you can imagine just the activity that came out of that from the design world.
So we can expect a perfectly flawless vote in Florida.
Well, there have been several elections since then, and I don't know whether we fully penetrated that particular state, but we're working on it.
Another question, aside from all the serious stuff, what's one design failure that you see on a routine basis that drives you crazy that you would like to change?
Oh, aside from the typography that haunts me every day.
Letters being the wrong font and too far apart.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there is, God, there's just so many examples of this. I can't even.
You're looking at my clothing to begin with, and I'm a little nervous about that.
I can't even begin. I think we're finding, one of the areas that's really emerging is, sort of the use of crowdsourced design ideas, and sort of the online availability of ready-made design. You can go online and find, your business card design for $29.95, and you can skip the whole process of hiring a designer and working with a professional to kind of go through that process really effectively. So, we're just seeing just an absolute tidal wave of horrendous business materials, websites, and printed materials just flooding the business world.
You're saying that somebody didn't design those somewhere?
Oh, somebody did.
But you can't call that person can't call him or herself a designer.
Oh, they I'm sure they do.
Oh, okay.
And that's a challenging problem for us. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, God knows there's no bad journalism going out there in the country, and I don't feel bad
Right.
about any of it.
There's certainly an analogy there.
Yeah, I would think.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have. I think we've wasted enough time.
Really?
Yeah, I think
We've
pretty
burned
much.
through? Yeah.
Let's turn the conversation over to folks here in the audience who have joined us. Tell us your name and where you're from, please.
Yes, my name is Patrick Redmond, and I'm from the Twin Cities. And Doug, for the benefit of the listeners, could you explain what the letters AIGA stand for?
Yes, I'd love to, Patrick. AIGA stands for American Institute of Graphic Arts, and AIGA is a nearly 100-year-old organization celebrating our centennial in 2 years in 2014. It was originally founded by a group of book designers and typographers in New York, kind of a gentleman's club back in the day, when the term graphic arts really sort of represented the book arts, and that was sort of one of the early historical origins of graphic design and communication design as it is now. So as we have grown as an organization and as the profession has evolved, that term graphic arts has become a little bit outdated, and so we've sort of done kind of the unthinkable for an organization of professional communicators, and that is to sort of abandon the actual words and go with the acronym. So
as a matter of fact, when I went to the AIGA website, the first thing I wondered was, what does that stand for?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I had to root around for a while to find it out, because it ain't in the subhead, that's for sure.
Right.
I also wondered,
Cleverly hidden.
Cleverly hidden. Being a website for an association of 22,000 designers, what percentage of them hate the website design?
Oh God,
like 90%?
Can you imagine? Yeah, it's just the critique that we subject ourselves to is just not for the faint of heart.
You look pretty tough. Another over here.
I'm Josh from Minneapolis, and I'm curious, when you talk about using design for social change, do you need to be an entrepreneur for that, or do you need to give away your services, or how are you going to get paid?
Yeah, that's a big question around this, because and one of the reasons I think that designers have struggled to work in that space effectively is because we've done it on a quote-unquote pro bono basis, or given our work away for free. And oftentimes that's going to be an important way for us to begin to work in that space, but it's not a sustainable way. I mean, if we're working on a large scale project on a strictly pro bono basis, that project just cannot live in a design practice for very long. It's always going to be pushed to the edges. It's always going to be done after hours and on the weekends, and it's never going to find its way into the core of the practice. So we've got to be finding, yes, entrepreneurial ways and other ways to fund these projects. Now, there is money out there for worthwhile projects. We just need to get more sophisticated about finding that money and finding the right ways to access it. We're not very good at that right now. Designers need to be better at writing grant applications. That's something that's just not in our job description right now. We just don't operate in that way. In some ways, it's going to require us to again rethink our business model and see if we can get more direct access to that type of funding.
I'm told that professional photographers are increasingly having a hard time convincing people to hire them when there are digital cameras and there is iPhoto or Photoshop out there. Is the same thing happening with designers, given that the Mac that I buy or the PC is loaded with stuff where I can design brochures?
Absolutely, that's been one of the great challenges of our profession over the last generation. Starting with the introduction of the Mac, at which point we all thought, oh well, this is the end of design as we know it.
It's a beautiful machine, and it's going to kill me.
Yeah, and now everybody's going to be a designer. That didn't happen, but it required us as designers to sort of dial up our game, get better at articulating the value of what we do.
What's the education path for a designer? How do you become, presumably if you have an eye and talent, you're a designer. is there a formal accreditation process?
Yeah, most designers will go through a four-year program of one kind or another, either through a liberal arts university with an accredited design program, or through an art and design college, much like Minneapolis College of Art and Design or College of Visual Arts here in St. Paul.
Yeah, Patrick Farrisee from St. Paul. Is the AIGA active in lobbying the educational institutions nationally to actually encourage them to teach business courses? The school that I attended, Art Center College of Design, there's one class, and I've also been an instructor at schools here locally. There's virtually no instruction on the business side. If we're going to be encouraging designers to be entrepreneurial,
Yeah.
don't they need the education? Why are we looking to other people to be the business people?
Right.
Why don't we become the business people and have that part of the educational process?
Exactly. Yeah, it absolutely is, and AIGA is playing an active role in working with NASAD, which is the accrediting body of schools of art and design, to influence that. But you're absolutely right. I mean, it's in order for us to be more sophisticated as business people, how do we do that? We pick up a book, we go to a website, we nudge our brother-in-law who happens to have an MBA. These are not really effective ways to really change a profession. And it really does need to happen at that academic level. And we're seeing more and more graduate level programs that are combining design with a traditional MBA track and coming up with some interesting results. And it is challenging, though, to fit that component into an already crowded undergraduate curriculum.
My name's Ryan. I'm from St. Paul. And just like in the last year and a half, I would say, with the rise of Pinterest and Instagram and infographics, I feel like we've seen kind of a trend towards more visual content in the realm of social media. Just wondering, how do you see that fueling these changes you're seeing in the design industry? And is that also part of the problem, as you're saying, where everybody thinks they're a designer or a photographer if they're on Instagram?
Right. Well, I mean, part of the problem is just visual clutter, and all of the media that you just described. It just contributes to that. So it gets harder and harder to get a clear message through all of that clutter. I would argue that's a great place for a designer to make an argument for what they do. What we do as designers is to cut through the clutter, to find clear ways to communicate a message. And so I would say if you are a business or an organization trying to do that, trying to find a way to cut through the clutter, you need to be working with a designer.
Can't count on Instagram and its automatic pinhole camera filter to do things.
Yeah, it does come up with some nice shots, but yeah, there are limits.
There are people who worry that because of what's happening with social media, what's happening in the internet space, that perhaps we're becoming a more visual culture and a less verbal or literate culture. A, do you think that's true? And B, being a visual guy, do you despair about that at all?
I think it's natural for us to evolve in the way we communicate. I mean, I think we're becoming a differently literate culture, not necessarily more or less. It's evolving. It's naturally going to evolve with all of the new technology and new media that we have access to now.
Two more questions. One right here.
My name is Liz Greenbaum from Minneapolis. I am very impressed with the discussion you had about using design as social change. I run an arts organization in Minneapolis where we have people taking classes, and many of them are children. And the minute you start describing this design thing with the whole health aspects of it, sometimes we have children coming in with various medical issues, and we've had children with EpiPens that are allergic to various foods and the like, allergies. And I remember years ago when one was given to me by a parent, and they're giving me this pen that I'm supposed to, have around in case. And they described to me exactly what I'm supposed to do if this child goes into anaphylactic shock.
Yeah.
And when you're talking about design elements, you're talking about life and death issues. And I really totally agree with you wholeheartedly, because more recently, a parent came in with an EpiPen, and lo and behold, right on this thing, although I knew what to do now with all the discussions I've had, were beautifully designed, very simple pictures,
Yeah.
simple words that really made me feel comfortable that I knew what to do. And
Right.
it made all the world of difference.
I think, yeah, I think you're making a great case for clear and simple and effective design. One of the, when we talk about use of visual language, I mean, I think as you're telling your story of, what if there was a language barrier there? What if the family, was not speaking English in the home, and they were trying to communicate to you these complex instructions? I mean, even doing that when you all speak the same language is very confusing and scary. But if there is a language barrier, then visuals become the way that we transcend that we cross over that.
And I got to tell you, that first time, there was absolutely nothing on it other than the prescription,
Yeah.
literally. And
One more question, anyone?
I just have a thought. I just went along the same lines. Do you regret having to have sold your business to go along that path?
Some days, yes. Some days, yes. And, there were a lot of factors at play in that. And, ultimately we, I think, have a peace of mind about the decision we made. And some days it's a little hard to take, yeah.
Hi, Charles Yule from Minneapolis, and I'm going to kind of build off that last question a little bit. You talked about the successes and the failures of Health Simple. With the benefit of hindsight and within the bounds of whatever draconian non-disclosure agreements you've had to sign, do you think you would have handled that differently knowing what you know now?
I don't know. I don't know that there was a whole lot that we could have anticipated about that. We certainly knew getting into the big business world that there were risks and that this would leave our nest and that we would have less control over it. And that was certainly something that we went into eyes wide open. Would we perhaps have decided not to go into that world and to nurture it, as a homegrown business on a smaller scale for a longer period of time? Perhaps, but there were a whole lot of risks to that particular path too, that we needed to take into account. I need to point out, if I could, Charles, who just asked that question, is founder of an organization in the Twin Cities here called Art Crank, which combines bike culture and poster design. And they have just a series of really amazing art openings around these series of posters that are created by local artists and designers around the theme of biking and cycling. And it's an example of when we talk about the craft of design, and here I am talking about all these new ways that designers can be working, sort of new progressive ways. And what Art Crank is an example of is designers getting back to their roots as crafts people and makers and creators. And I mean, as you can imagine, these posters are just exquisitely designed and printed. And that's another sort of layer of transformation that's happening within the design community and profession. That's really exciting. So we've got different layers of activity that's happening in our profession. That's really very stimulating and creates lots of tension and great discussions. But that's one aspect of design that I don't want to leave out of the conversation here.
Journalists sometimes save the gotcha question for last, and I'll do that now.
I thought we just had a couple gotcha.
No. You haven't experienced it yet. You're married to a designer. Is it hard to get dressed in the morning where the two of you get up and you're like, you can't wear that. Those don't go together.
It's yeah, it's terrible. I mean, yes, it's
All right, we'll leave it at that.
yes.
Doug Powell, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
You've been listening to NPR Presents, the latest installment of Bright Ideas, a program from Minnesota Public Radio News that presents fresh thinking on big issues. Our guest this time, Twin Cities designer Doug Powell from the